Hey, welcome to another week of the Aaron Running Podcast. This will probably be the last podcast of 2024. So I'm excited for this one. Christmas is just right around the corner. Then we got the New Year's. Appreciate everybody that's been listening, watching, commenting, giving thumbs up on here. And if you watch and you haven't subscribed yet, I would ask that you please do that. You can just stay up to date with all the videos that are coming out. It'll notify you on there, and yeah, it helps boost the numbers for here too, and get get the videos out to more people. So for the last podcast of the year, we're going to have on my good friend Caleb Waite, and he was actually my very first guest on the podcast, and one of my really good friends, one of my longest friends that I've had now for a while. So I'm going to add him on here, and there he is.
Good to see you, Aaron.
Caleb, just in case people didn't watch the previous one back in the day, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yes. So I've known Aaron. We've known each other for 14 years or so. You were in young adults ministry at the church, and you began leading the youth group at the church that we were both at for many years. And I was still in high school at that time. We were only three years apart in age or something like that. So even though you were my youth leader, you were still pretty close to me. So we became close friends. Since then, and after a few years later, through college, I went to seminary at Westminster Seminary, California. Graduated there, and then began working in Christian media and podcasting, and worked on a number of different podcasts and written a variety of articles for different outlets and sites. And uh, yeah, I love Christmas and love theology and church history. So this is a win. We get to talk about some of my favorite things.
Yeah, and so for the topic today, we're gonna discuss the idea or this thing going around that like Christmas is pagan.
Mhm.
And I saw your article that you wrote. Is it Core Christianity that was in?
That's right. So I
Yeah.
work for Sola Media, which is we have a variety of projects and brands. One of them is White Horse Inn, Modern Reformation, and Core Christianity is a project of which I published this kind of. It's a free download. I can share the link with Aaron, and he can share it with the audience. But it's simple. It's just 5 reasons why Christmas is not a pagan holiday. So trying to debunk and unravel some of the tropes around the season that have become very common, on the History Channel and pop culture, and now on YouTube, TikTok, you see these things of, the pagan origins of Christmas and all that. And so, yeah, trying to address those claims and help give Christians confidence that you haven't been duped. Christmas is indeed not pagan.
Yeah, and I think for some of the circles that I have run in previously, like the more charismatic circles, this is like a big thing. They're always trying to find
Mm,
some kind of pagan roots to something because they think there's like demons behind everything, and you have to
yeah,
cast it
better
all
be
out,
careful. No,
So
it's in the atmosphere for sure. It's not. I mean, as you, there's definitely Christian sects and movements who are worried about the purity of the church and being upright, and so they have a tendency to be suspicious about like our things, secretly being smuggled in to our faith and practice that are unhealthy, right? That can kind of be maybe the best articulation of what they're after. And then there's less good reasons, right? People, and we'll talk about this more later, but sometimes people are just inherently suspicious, and they're always trying to find y- you know they're just attracted to narratives that are like everything you've known or been raised with is a lie, And so a lot of people love to go down those rabbit holes when people like to kind of tickle their ears and fancies with some interesting speculative theories. There's still a lot just in pop culture through even some not like non-specialist historians who might be featured on the History Channel, or even people like Dan Brown, who wrote the Da Vinci Code, who very explicitly says that uh, in the Da Vinci Code uh, had some stark claims as to why Christmas is a ripoff and completely pagan. So people are kind of inundated with this trope, this idea from a variety of angles inside the church and outside the church. Do you want to get into the
Yeah.
rationale then?
Yeah. So maybe just explain maybe like that first reason why Christmas is not a pagan holiday that we had in that article that you wrote.
Right. And I think the simplest thing that I would like to communicate is that um, there are really no silver bullets that are completely going to debunk and pop the bubble of of a tradition that is as old as Christianity. Um, but we are still drawn to those ideas. What's the Achilles heel? What's the silver bullet that's going to prove that this whole thing is a ruse, is a lie, is this coercive grab for just power and authority and control, and that kind of a thing. And I think what Christians should ultimately know is that there aren't these silver bullets that are just going to shatter the things that you hold dear. um so I think we can find comfort that there's not this one theory that's going to unravel everything that you believe, everything that you know are familiar with and know, um and practice. And so I think the first point I would just make is that the early church, who were the ones who are being accused of in these ideas, these tropes, they're accused of basically capitulating to the pagan culture of their day to try to water down Christianity, make it more palatable. And so they're trying to, uh, these Christians are observing the Roman festivals of the day, and they're like, okay, there's a lot of these, these Romans, pagans, like to participate in these festivals. Why don't we kind of smuggle some of that into Christianity to make Christianity more palatable? Why don't we rip off these pagan myths and festivals in order to kind of boost our to make our religion, which is new, more interesting, more attractive to the people around us. And I think people can rest assured that the early church just they weren't dumb. They weren't being duped into. They weren't tricked into bringing paganism into their piety and practice and worship, and they were not, being conniving in like they weren't purposely, trying to water things down to appear more attractive um, to their culture. There's a claim, often claims that the pagan festivals like Saturnalia, Sol Invictus were uh, were the things that Christians ripped off. And I think what I'd say to, well, there's some sources I think people should consult. I'm not a specialist in ancient church history. I've not done a PhD on these matters, but there's a few things that I found helpful that get into this in a more detailed way that I think are helpful to common listeners. And one is an article by Andrew McGowan called How December 25 Became Christmas. It's a very long piece. I recommend reading that. Kevin DeYoung has a popular article called Is Christmas a Pagan Ripoff? That's a fantastic piece. There's also, I don't know, I checked this book out from the library. I don't know if it is even in print or if you can buy it, but it's called Toward the Origins of Christmas by Susan Kroll. And that I found was quite helpful as well. And then if you're familiar with a popular podcast called The Rest is History with Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook, delightful show. They did a Christmas episode last year called, Christmas. Is it pagan or Christian? And they, I think they're both agnostic from what I understand. And they pretty much, they don't have skin in the game. They're not trying to defend Christianity, as it were, and Christmas. They're just historians, but they pretty much go through myth after myth of Christmas being pagan and debunk the whole thing. So those are great resources to consult. But specifically to like Dan Brown in the Da Vinci Code has this line where this the character who's this wise sage, this scholar, says that Christmas absolutely was a ripoff of, Krishna and Dionysus and Mithras and everything from the incarnation to the resurrection to December 25th being the birth of Christ. All of these things are pagan ripoffs. And it's just stated as if it's completely true. And there is zero historical support for any of it. There's no ancient sources to support any claims that December 25th was any of those pagan gods' days of birth, or that festivals or their traditions or that their stories bear any resemblance to what we see in the New Testament in the Gospels around the life of Jesus Christ. There's zero historical evidence. There's zero ancient manuscripts. There's zero mention. There's like, even the dates are completely wrong. Like, you can just go and read Osiris was not born, like said to have been born at those dates. Mithras, completely not associated in any way. Dionysus, none of them are actually in the texts that talk about those myths. None of them are associated with December 25th at all. So it's just a complete fiction that, again, is stated in pop culture that kind of gets wind, and people are like, oh yeah, that sounds interesting. And then it kind of, starts to hold weight, or it starts to, at least, as a Christian, you don't know those things, who's read up on those myths to actually know what to say to that. And so it can kind of feel unsettling, like when people just start to throw those, so-called historical facts that they may have heard just from Dan Brown, the Da Vinci Code, or on a podcast, but it's baseless. It's complete fiction. But it gets to the fact of like, where did some of those tropes come from? And so I'll read this from that Susan Kroll book I mentioned. So here's a quote I include in my article. And she says this. She says, the evidence for the origins of Christmas and the several centuries of pondering that evidence has resulted in spurious texts, ambiguous evidence, lengthy speculation, trivial dead-ended issues, and a mounting pile of reasonable sounding good guesses. We don't know when Christmas started. We don't know who individually or collectively started it. We don't know exactly where or why or how they got the date through our guesses, though our guesses are probably not too far from the mark. And then I'll quote this from the Kevin DeYoung piece that I mentioned, and I include this quote in my article as well. He says, "There's no suggestion that the birth of Jesus was set at the time of pagan holidays until the 12th century, far hundreds of years after Christmas became actually celebrated within the Christian church's calendar." Um, when Dionysus stated, when Dionysus Bar Salabi stated that Christmas was moved from January 6 to December 25 to correspond with Sol Invictus. So centuries later, post-Enlightenment scholars of comparative religions began popularizing the idea that the early Christians retrofitted winter solstice festivals for their own purposes. For the first millennium of the church's history, no one made that connection. So a lot of these tropes, they're not only picked up, as you mentioned, in various Christian sects and circles today. They're not only in pop culture, but they kind of derive from this post-Enlightenment scholars in the 19th century who are basically they are reading much later texts, and they're kind of retrofitting, they're kind of reading back and connecting the dots on their own, but it's all on basically faulty history on documents that are much later that are easily debunked today. But that's kind of where these things start to come from, and then they just seep into this game of telephone or a big fish story where it gets bigger, wilder, and more tantalizing. And yeah, it won't exactly go away. I think people are always going to be drawn and attracted to these kinds of things.
Yeah. I don't know if you saw recently, but Billy Carson was like he's like a conspiracy kind of guy who goes back and says that like, well, if you actually read some of the other texts, like Jesus was never crucified and
Oh, sure.
all this stuff. Well, Wesley Huff, who's like a legit,
Yeah. Apologist.
manuscript like scholar, he did
Mhm.
a debate with him, and the guy was just like, I mean, it was not a fair debate. Just to put it that way, like any of these like claims that Billy Carson had, Wesley Huff was just like, no, if you actually read the manuscripts, and he would like pull one off his bookshelf and be like, here you
Yeah,
go, like,
yeah.
like
Oh, man.
here's a copy of one, I'll read it for you in the Greek, like,
Oh,
and
man.
I feel like it's the same kind of thing. Most of these things are just like, um, the claims that are made, like you're saying in culture, or like from the Da Vinci Code, which was completely fictional.
Yeah,
And then a real scholar who's actually going to have access to like primary sources is going to be like,
right.
no, like that's
Yeah,
not real, you
right
know?
now. Yeah, and there's other scholars, though, who quoting these kind of 19th century post-Enlightenment thinkers, generally, they see them as like, they seem reliable. If they say it's pagan, then, well, it might be. And so sometimes they don't even do their due diligence on primary sources, trying to connect the dots on those. Well, they just allow others to connect the dots for them, is what kind of ends up being the case. But if any like honest historian looks at like, is this an actual ripoff? Like December 25, the stories of Jesus and the Gospels. Is it basically the same as Dionysus, Osiris, Adonias, or Adonis? Um, uh, yeah, it's not at all. Um, and I guess the point to be made is that especially Christians in the fourth and third centuries, they were not gullible. They were not conniving. They weren't just after power, right? We don't have to look back at history in this cynical way. They were much more ordinary people, just like you and I. And largely, they just were very careful and thoughtful about their worship and practice. It's not that we need to even view those people as amazing heroes, of which did not, like, as if nothing went wrong in church history, right? And now they're all these victims to these conspiracy theories and stuff. But no, the fact is they were ordinary Christians who had real beliefs and convictions about the Bible, about Jesus, and they cared very deeply about the purity of their worship. That, I think, that's one thing to commend the early church for, and one thing you can kind of take to the bank. They were very sensitive to claims that you are paganizing, like, the story of Jesus. They would find that so scandalous and outrageous, and they were so careful to distinguish their religion, like the sacred texts of the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible. They they would find that claim that they were somehow either being duped by pagan culture around them, or that they were smuggling it in. They would find that so offensive and scandalous. So one thing you can trust of the early Christians is that they were sensitive to those claims, to those accusations, and that they would do everything in their power to just be very careful about anything that they incorporate into their worship, um, into the life of the church. They would be very careful that it wasn't pagan, that it wasn't a ripoff. They didn't hold those things in high esteem. They were purposely trying to not be like the culture around them. And honestly, if you read Augustine, if you read the church fathers, if you just read these ancient um, writers, that was so clear. It is so clear that they are not trying to accommodate and water things down. They don't have this odd agenda. It is so clear that they just earnestly, devoutly love the biblical scriptures and care about the worship of the church, and they're very thoughtful. And so to kind of lump them into this, these theories that from the Da Vinci Code and what ha- have you is really unfortunate. Um, yeah, yeah. The, there is one festival that I think people, the other festivals that are named in these theories are often completely not even at the right time of year. Um, but there is one December festival, Roman feast and celebration of Saturnalia, around the god Saturn. If you go to the Rest is History podcast episode on this, they talk about that festival in detail. They're like, if there's any of these claims that is might hold more weight than the others, this might be it. And basically, Saturnalia was it used to be, Augustus had it as a 2-day festival, and then it was broadened to be 3 days long. And basically, it was kind of like Carnival. It was like, going to New Orleans in February just before Lent, right? It was basically a subversive uh, celebration where a lot of people kind of let the steam off and got to do a little, to be not just more, merry and gregarious. It was a way to reverse your kind of roles in society just for a few days. So it was like a a non-violent version of the purge. Uh, it was men were often seen, they would dress, they would have this like feminine ball gown type of dress that they would wear just to be subversive. It's not, that's not ordinarily what men would wear. Slaves could basically have this odd truth or dare game with their masters, tell their masters to do something, and their masters were obligated to do it because it was Saturnalia. Um, and a lot of people loved this festival. The poets especially did. The philosophers didn't care for it. But it was in December, and it normally ended on December 23rd. And so there were gifts exchanged as well, but they weren't just like get your friends the most thoughtful gift you could think of. They were like very specific carvings and icons and paintings of things that were sometimes cheap, sometimes expensive. Um, so, okay, is Christmas a ripoff of Saturnalia? And again, basically the only similarity is that there are some gifts exchanged. There is some merriment going around. Um, and it's in December. And that's as close as the evidence as it comes to proving that it's associated with Christmas. And again, I would say, like, if that convinces you that it's for sure a ripoff of Saturnalia, um, well then, I mean, there's so many other similarities and things that basically there are countless pagan feast days every, throughout the year. So if Christians did not choose to celebrate Christmas during December and they chose to celebrate it another time of the year, basically there's going to be other feast days around that are approximately close to it where this accusation of paganization is going to be inevitable. But the fact is similarities, or being approximately close to each other, it doesn't actually prove causality. It doesn't prove that they were actually intentionally ripping it off or that it influenced what happened. Fact is, like, people, like, the church didn't start to practice gift exchanging, or just people with Christmas didn't practice gift exchanging until hundreds and hundreds of years later. Advent was in the church calendar as of the 4th century. Um, and so was Easter. And the whole thing of like Santa and gift exchange and candy canes, all that stuff, those things are cultural artifacts that appear much, much, much later. And so there really aren't any similarities to any of the pagan festivals between Christmas and those things, um, um, at all, to prove definite um, causality. The again, the Christian use of Advent in worship and the church calendar, their reasons for doing so have nothing to do with being subverting one's roles in society like one did at Saturnalia. Um, it's not even close. You're celebrating the God man, God becoming incarnate. You're not playing truth or dare with your boss at work. You're not dressing up like the opposite gender. You're not doing any
Well,
of
people might be doing that nowadays.
they were not doing that in the 4th century when
If you go to like a PCUSA church, no, I'm just kidding.
Redeemed Zoomer is going to come after you, man. But you were it was a time of contrition. It was a time of, um, thinking upon the comings of Christ, his first and second advent. It's just, it bears there's really no similarities other than it's a type of feast, some type of commemoration, and it takes place in December. Um, yeah, but we can get into the actual reasons why Christians might have chose December 25th as Christmas
Yeah.
in a bit.
Yeah, and I always say too, like, say it was like this idea of kind of like erasing the pagan holiday and kind of, you know,
Replacing it.
replacing it with a Christian one. And maybe like equivalent, because some people will say, well, they built churches on top of like pagan temples, things like that. So this
Mhm,
was kind of like a way of doing that with like a holiday.
mm,
So what? I mean, Christ conquered. This isn't like a some kind of spiritual day that no matter what you do, you can't escape like the demon worship or something. Like,
mm,
so what if it was in Christ? And now we celebrate the birth of Christ on top of it. Christ conquered all. He deserves to be glorified. And if we're going to choose a day to celebrate his birth on that day, and it just so happened to have been also a pagan holiday, who
mhm.
cares?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, I mean, you're not gonna get away. I mean, there's so many, dozens, hundreds of pagan feast days commemorating some god, some, you know, thing in history. Um, so again, that's gonna be inevitable to some sense of that. It's either on the same day or it's kind of close. But that just wasn't the rationale of the early church. They weren't even just trying to baptize things that were, let's baptize Saturnalia and make that Christian. That wasn't what they were doing. They there's a I think, to go back to that Susan Kroll quote, like, we don't have a direct source that says this person came up with the idea for Christmas, this bishop, this presbyter. We don't have that. It's something that emerges during the fourth century. Um, and for better or worse, it has become incorporated into what is the church calendar, and then a cultural celebration in around the world. And the rationale, I think most historians find persuasive. One of the best guesses we have as to why December 25th was the date that the early church chose to celebrate the in, incarnation was based on theological reasoning and Jewish tradition. So, which is completely opposite of paganizing. There was a Jewish tradition that basically said that, men, even back to Abraham died, these great figures died on the day that they were conceived. It's not, there's nowhere in the Bible that explicitly states that kind of a thing. But through as Christians read the Gospels and the whole scope of Scripture, they tried their best to surmise, yeah, when was Christ born? I don't think we can for sure definitively say, no one can, that Jesus was born on December 25th. But basically, the rationale from this Jewish tradition and this kind of theological reasoning was that Jesus um, was likely crucified in spring on March 25th, and so, if he died then, perhaps it was that was the day he was conceived, and so therefore 9 months later from March, do the math, is December, and so um, the Jesus's birth was often believed to be the um, anniversary. Uh, um, sorry, I'm going to read this quote. Um, it's often thought Christians chose December 25th as the date to celebrate Jesus's birth because it was believed to be the anniversary of his incarnation, which was 9 months after the Annunciation on March 25th. So the celebration of Christmas was a way for Christians to emphasize the humanity of Jesus, and the theory that Christmas is a pagan festival. Oh wait, I'll stop there. But it's like, I mean, that idea is actually, I mean, I don't think we can say again for sure that he was crucified on that day, that he was conceived on that day in March, and therefore he was born in December. But that is that's Christian reasoning. That's Christian rationale. That's not people drawing from pagan sources. Um, this is even embedded in uh, medieval scholar like t- Tolkien, because he has the ring being thrown into Mount Doom on December, or in on March 25th, and the company leaves from Rivendell on December 25th. So it's like these that kind of tradition of thinking about time and place of death, conception and birth, that ra- rationale is in the air of the church. That is a Christian and even Jewish way of thinking about those important events, the important events in important figures' lives. Um, that's far different than trying to rip off again Saturnalia or Sol Invictus.
Yeah, and so I don't know if this changes subjects a little bit, but like when it comes to like the idea of Santa Claus, we know that there was like a real Saint Nicholas,
Hmm.
and I always tell my kids this, you know, because we never really did the whole Santa Claus thing with them.
Sure,
I
sure.
always tell them like Santa Claus was a real person. His name was Saint Nicholas, and he died a long time ago. And
Yeah,
they
yeah.
went to school and were talking to other kids about how Santa Claus was real, but he's dead.
Oh,
Which to other kids
awesome. That's awesome.
was all they heard was Santa Claus is dead kind of
Of
thing.
course. Yeah,
Yeah.
of course.
But do you know any of like that kind of backstory about how Saint Nicholas got wrapped up into like the Christmas message?
Well, I think again, this is a difference between like history, like there's history and then there's folk history, which is its own kind of um special specialization. There's no edict that has gone out that says people must celebrate Halloween at this day, right? I mean, the Council of Nicaea, right, is this kind of like event. It was the council was commissioned by Constantine. The parties present. The theological matters being discussed. Other parts of history too, like when wars took place and that kind of thing. But folk history, like how do you know how why is it that we become that people's and cultures start to do certain things and it's just becomes a part of their traditions when there's no uh clear events that you can tie it back to, and there's no clear like edicts, and there's no clear um things to immediately trace it to. And the thing with Christmas is it's largely it's that kind of practice of history. There was no edict from Constantine to say Christmas, let's do it. There was no bishop to say the same thing that you can immediately trace it back to. It's a kind of, I don't want to say it's folk history, but something like Santa definitely is a type of folk history. It's just this the it's a thing that comes up within culture that is then um spread, popularized, and then commercialized. And that happens all the time. It happens with music and songs, right? Like a genre of music. Whose first idea, what was it to create a certain genre of music? I mean, there might be some artist who you can trace those things back to, but oftentimes it's like this region, this genre came out of it, and then it became popular, and then it became shared and commercialized, sold as, album songs, and that kind of a thing. um the book I would recommend on that is, let's see, I have it down here, it's in my article. um the oh, yeah, Stephen Nissenbaum, The Battle for Christmas: A Social and Cultural History of Our Most Cherished Holiday. So he spends at least a couple chapters talking about just the origins of the popular idea of Santa Claus, which uh, I I forget exactly if it was an exact adaptation of Saint Nicholas from the 4th century. Again, sometimes that's us retrofitting things that we connect the the dots on our own. For I think without trying to butcher this storyline, there's a historian by the name of Ryan Reeves, and he has a YouTube channel on the origins of Santa. And I would just encourage everyone to look up Ryan Reeves, The Origins of Santa. He's a Christian historian. His channel is really good, and I think he helps delineate between like folk history, how things emerge in cultures, and the kind of history that we know. It goes back to very clear figures, events, and texts, and those kinds of things. But again, it's like it goes back to these things emerge within cultures that are popularized and then commercialized, right? The fact is, the church who started celebrating Advent could not imagine things like White Christmas, things like Elf, these movies, Home Alone. You know, it's culture and tradition and folk traditions that have made those things, um, enmeshed them and made them kind of what they are today.
Yeah, and then another question I was gonna throw out there too. Like the Christmas tree, right? I've always heard that this is like a pagan thing. I think tied to the is it one of the Scandinavian holidays, like Yule or something like that,
Yeah.
where they use that tree in their whatever festival or
Hmm.
Is this something that we're doing? Is this like demon worship by having a Christmas tree in the home?
Again, I think it goes back to like what axioms are we kind of assuming that is true? Are we assuming all Christians in history are duped into paganizing their own religion? Or are we assuming that they are conniving and using these traditions as a kind of Trojan horse to sneak something bad in there? I think that propensity needs to be questioned. I don't know all the like the ins and outs and the origins of the Christmas tree. I think, some people bring up a few verses in Jeremiah that's like saying, talking about decorating such a tree with stuff is a part of like pagan idolatry. But that's of Jeremiah's day. It's the fact is the history of the Christmas tree is again much later from when Christmas first started being celebrated, much later from when Advent became a part of the church calendar, hundreds of years later. And I think it's much more, and those things are a testament to culture and folk tradition, um, than it is an act of an ideology of like, this tree must symbolize this, and I must make it a part of my traditional celebrations. It's not the case. That's not how cultures and traditions come about. You know, you can decide as a family, like, we're going to do this. This is going to be a tradition every year now. And you can just decide one day. But that's not often how traditions naturally come about. Um, it's not philosophical. It's not ideological. It kind of comes about through a variety of practices. People didn't just sit down and say, "Now Christmas trees are a part of our celebration, and here's what they mean, and here's what they stand for." When people try to think try to think of like what they symbolize and what they stand for, again, that's a kind of retrofitting. Like, you can decide, you can now give meaning to that, and then read that back into history. But that does not mean like the people who where that originated from. It doesn't mean that they had those same ideological motivations. They're just like, oh, that, for a lot, it could just be a nice place to display presence. It doesn't have to be ideological in any way whatsoever. So I think, one, Ryan Reeves also might have a video on Christmas trees. Wes does what? Anyway, I don't know exactly the rationale there, but I would say, again, it's impossible to say that this is a clear paganizing thing that we should basically purify ourselves from. Obviously, it's not biblically mandated whatsoever, but that does not mean it's a Trojan horse for paganism at all. And history is much more complicated, much more ordinary and boring. And again, it's not history is not about the right and wrong side, villains versus good people. It's ordinary people who are just like you and I, who are doing things that they're conscious of, and things that they're not conscious of. Um, so I think this goes back to our propensity of, are we thinking about our the people who came before us as simpletons or as villains? And I think that is a terrible way to think about doing history as a rule. Um, and I think that should humble us and encourage us at the same time.
Yeah. No, I was just thinking about that. Did you used to have in your bio on Twitter that you were going to be like the biggest Christmas tree farm owner or something like that?
That's right. That's it. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, okay. So I will admit, like, I've always loved Christmas, and I've always kind of, intuitively felt like there's no way this is like, this conniving, dark thing. And so maybe I'm biased, sure. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's just how I was raised, or because I'm sappy or sentimental or what. But yeah, yeah, I did joke at one time saying I'm the future owner of the greatest Christmas tree farm in the world, for sure. And I think, yeah, it is a pipe dream. One day I would love to have a Christmas tree farm, or at least a lot, right, where you sell Christmas trees.
Well, it might be also too because you're Swedish, right? So you might have some pagan roots in there, dude. So
That's right. Deep down, my blood, it's crying out. It's craving the Yule. It's craving the the Christmas tree. Oh man. No. Good night.
um, cool.
I think the last thing I'll say
Yeah.
for folks is like, that propensity to either have this kind of hermeneutic of suspicion is a very modern thing. It's postmodern, you know. The modernism, modernity was often this thing in, uh, you know, there's it, there was a narrative at one time that um, you know, life is optimistic. You can build anything. You can have your, family, 2.5 kids, the white picket fence, the American dream. It's all within your grasp. Um, the world is getting better every day in every way. Humanity is progressing. All of, this kind of theory out of the Enlightenment of the limitless potential of humanity. And that is what you might classify as modernism. If you look at like old movies, it's kind of that summary. It's very clear cut. The narrative is clear, the characters are clear. You know who's the good guy, you know who the bad guy is. And the end of the day, right, the hero wins, he gets the girl, all this type of thing. Like that's a kind of like um narrative. But postmodernism is is an act where those narratives are held in suspicion. What if the world gets worse? What happens when world wars take place? What happens when millions of innocent people are slaughtered? What happens when I do all the right things and I don't have the family and the white picket fence and the American dream that I was sold ends up kind of being this lie. Anyway, postmodernism is this kind of self-reflection where all of those narratives seem very trite, and they're like, and then you're like, actually the people who use those narratives, those people want power. They want to keep people down, they want to keep people chasing the carrot at the end of the stick. And so they question any narrative at all, any culture's truth claims, any culture's traditions, right? And so even if you are not a postmodern philosopher who says the narratives around God and morality are a lie, um, if you have this kind of innate suspicion of these stories you're told, they're like, yeah, there's probably something to the history of Christmas that's actually, dark or conniving, or yeah, the church and its institutions are actually after power, and they're probably lying to us to keep us down. And you can point to anecdotes where abuse of authority has taken place or what have you. But if that is your like default setting, then you are thoroughly a modern individual. It doesn't matter how conservative you are or if you're in church or what have you. That is postmodernism has kind of seeped deep into your bones. And I'm not saying you need to be super earnest and foolish and believe everything you're told. Like you can go ahead, question things, um, do your own research, you know. Um, I'm not saying to not do that and just to believe whatever the church says and whatever is handed down to you. But if your default setting is this hermeneutic of suspicion, I think you are much more a product of your cynical modern environment than you think you are. Even if even if you're not like a Antifa Portland, barista, whatever, right? It's not we need to be a little more self-reflective, I think, about our propensity to go down these rabbit holes of theories and suspicion and think more earnestly about ourselves. And guess what? I think when you do that, you start to view history and people in a more humane way, in the fact of like they weren't people in history weren't all that different than you are. Maybe some of them were more courageous. Maybe some of them were more like villains, but not all of them were simpletons. Not all of them were duped into something, and not all of them were conniving in no way. And so when you do that, you start to just honestly be a little less anxious about how when these theories are thrown to you, they're not going to send you through for a loop, because your axiom, your baseline isn't like, yeah, I'm probably being lied to every second of every day. Someone's out to get me. It's more of like, yeah, things are complicated. I don't have all the answers. I can't tell you about the pagan festivals of ancient Rome, but that doesn't pass the smell test to me. And I think that's what Christians can rest in. You don't have to go read all these ancient texts to compare things to make sure you can feel good about celebrating Christmas. I think you can rest assured in the fact of the ancient church. They weren't dumb. They cared about the purity of worship, and they cared about um, holding reverent the gospel, which was so counterintuitive and alien to every myth in comparison. If you actually just read the gospels and then hear those other stories of Dionysus, Osiris, what have you, the contrast is so stark. And so, yeah, I think Christians can and should feel confident about enjoying Christmas.
Amen. Yes. And just to close out before we do, is there anything that you want to plug? I know did you
Yeah,
guys podcast, right? Did you guys start that new one, the solo one? Is
we
that
have
the
a
one you've been working
few.
on?
There's a few. So if you can go to see the work, I'm not on podcasts often, but I do produce them. You can go follow our work at Solo Media on YouTube, and you can download the. I'll make sure Aaron has the link to if you want to read the article, maybe share it with a friend or family member who's a Scrooge, and like, here's five reasons why Christmas is not a pagan holiday. Feel free to download that for free. I'll make sure you have that and in the show description. So I'll leave it at that.
Cool. All right, man. Thanks for coming on. And
Absolutely.
yeah, have a Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.